Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Kaplan. I am Manager of Public Programs at the Center for Jewish History. I'm happy to welcome you to today's lecture, and it's a very special one. We are pleased to host Miriam Schulz, who is currently an Association for Jewish Studies Dissertation Completion Fellow and was a graduate fellow at the Center and a generous contributor to our academic community. The Center for Jewish History is a home for the archival collections of 5 partner institutions: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and the Yeshiva University Museum. Together, these collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. Above all, though, the Center aims to be a home for our growing academic community, inspiring encounters, exchanges of ideas, and conversations, and witnessing groundbreaking explorations of the unparalleled archival resources we steward. Our speaker today, Miriam Schulz, is a PhD candidate in Yiddish studies at Columbia University and is nearing the finish line of her dissertation about Yiddish anti-fascism and Holocaust memory in the Soviet Union. Miriam has published widely on questions of Yiddish culture and the Holocaust. Her first monograph, about one of the earliest Jewish historical commissions that formed among the Polish Jewish refugee community in Vilnius and started to document the Holocaust in Poland as early as November 1939, was awarded the Hosenfeld-Shpilman Memorial Award in 2017 and the Scientific Award of the Polish Ambassador in Germany. Based on this monograph, she co-founded and manages the EU-funded Digital Humanities Project, We Refugees Archive. The archive gathers and brings into dialogue refugee voices from different cities of refuge in a trans-historical framework, and is meant to galvanize new narratives and discourses about the urgent question of refugeedom in the contemporary world on the basis of and through refugee voices themselves. We just have 2 reminders before we begin. You're welcome to write down your questions for the Q&A portion of our program. To do so, please use the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions throughout the program. Our program is recorded and will be available via the Center's website and YouTube channel soon, and we will email you the link to the recording as well. And now, without further ado, Miriam Schulz.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. And a big thank you to the Center for Jewish History, to Julie and Margot specifically, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work today. And of course, a big thank you to the Association for Jewish Studies, who awarded me their Dissertation Completion Fellowship. And I must say that this fellowship is a big relief in this crazy and unstabilizing year. And finally, thank you to everyone who's Zooming in. Really a big thank you for your interest and for taking the time out of your busy schedules in order to think with me about Holocaust memory, and more precisely about Holocaust memory within an environment that we have too easily dismissed as antithetical to the remembrance of the Holocaust, the Soviet Union. So since Zoom is an audiovisual medium, I will share with you my screen that we are all on the same page, so to speak. So let me do that. So today we will have a look into how many, not all, Soviet Jews commemorated the Holocaust, not against, but as part of the memory landscape of the Soviet Union. This memory landscape orbited around the Soviet experiences of the war and celebrated the victory over Nazi Germany. On the face of it, the particular Jewish suffering of the Holocaust had little to no place in this memory culture. But things were much more complicated, as they usually are, and Soviet Jews carved out spaces, primarily with the help of Yiddish, for the sake of commemorating the Holocaust as part of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. The important role of Yiddish can be explained by its superior status in Soviet Jewish culture since the early post-revolutionary days. In 1918, Yiddish was declared the national language of the Jewish people and the only legitimized framework to construct a Soviet Jewish culture that is secular and socialist, but still Jewish. And even after Stalin's anti-Semitic purges of the late 1940s and against the Yiddish cultural infrastructure, and despite a steadily shrinking post-war Soviet Yiddish public, Yiddish never lost its aura as the chief indicator and as a deliberate means of expressing Soviet Jewishness. It was an important marker of Holocaust memory as well. So I could not do my work without the valuable work of other scholars, of course, and I would like to mention the historian Arkady Seltzer specifically. His study, Unwelcome Memory, of 2019, essentially revolutionized the field of Soviet Holocaust memory and has influenced my work significantly. Arkady mapped an archipelago of over 700 Holocaust monuments erected legally in or just outside Soviet Städte and towns before 1991. And he demonstrated how the Jewish desire to memorialize Holocaust victims was met with, and I quote, high level of neutrality and at times even sympathy towards Jewish memorial initiatives by Soviet authorities. And the Jewish activists themselves, by and large, were not opposed to the Soviet regime, quite the contrary. So taking a cue from Seltzer, we will start by pondering why we haven't talked about the significant Holocaust memory until this point, and also explain the maybe mysterious title of my talk. Why do I refer to the famous Greek tragedy Antigone only to negate it? We will then move to 3 case studies of what I call Soviet Yiddish and vernacular Holocaust memory activism. And the accent here is on vernacularity. We will try to understand Soviet Jewish Holocaust memory through their own eyes and in the context of Soviet memory politics. We will get to know different projects of monumentalization in different parts of the Soviet Union by different generations of Soviet Jews with different knowledge of and relationship to Yiddish. And we will conclude with some final thoughts on the relevance of this Holocaust memory in our contemporary world. So when we think of Holocaust memory in the Soviet Union, we mostly think of suppression, structural anti-Semitism, amnesia, silence. This has much to do with Stalin, and rightly so. His anti-Semitic attacks between 1948 to 1953 attempted to destroy Soviet Yiddish culture and Soviet Jewish culture entirely. And Stalin's last crime fundamentally changed the way Soviet Jewishness could be approached in the West. Added to it came the deep anti-communism of the Cold War. It was hard to fathom any Jew that remained loyal to communism even after Stalin betrayed everything it stood for. And if at all, we situated Holocaust memory work that did take place in the Soviet Union in the minority of dissident circles and the Soviet Jewish immigration movement. And for good reasons. Holocaust memory did play an important part in these movements as one catalyst for them wanting to leave the Soviet Union. In a Cold War world, this narration of suppression and resistance made a lot of sense. And this narrative also has deep roots in the Western imaginary. And here I come to the Greek tragedy, Antigone. Antigone is a tragedy by the ancient Greek poet Sophocles, which epitomizes both the enormous political significance of sovereign control of public mourning. Creon prohibits the burial of his enemies, and the fascination with heroic acts that go against these regulations. Antigone is willing to risk her life in order to bury her brother. Questions of loyalty, civil disobedience, freedom of speech, the interconnected right to memory, and more importantly, its public recognition were, of course, urgent issues in the Cold War. And Antigone provided a useful script for our ideas of Holocaust memory under Soviet dictatorship. But by focusing entirely on Soviet Jewish dissident circle and the immigration movement and their struggle to commemorate the Holocaust, we mapped Antigone's simplistic binary of demonic suppression and heroic resistance onto the geopolitical, cultural, and memory wars of the Cold War. What the Antigonean view leaves necessarily out of view is memory labor that is hybrid, as it were, that tried to commemorate the Holocaust, not against, but as part of the Soviet memory landscape. And ideology, I think, is crucial here. We overlooked all those Jewish Soviets that did not follow in Antigone's footsteps, but were incredibly successful with their memory labor nonetheless. They were not Antigone's heirs, but still Holocaust memory practitioners in their own right. So let's take a look at what they did and how. Holocaust memory activism started early. In 1945, Dawid Dragunsky, a distinguished Soviet Jewish war hero and Soviet Yiddish correspondent, returned from the battlefields to his Ukrainian hometown. Seeing the state of the deserted mass graves, where 74 of his relatives were buried just outside the city, he approached the famous Soviet Yiddish theater director and actor Shlomo Micholz that we probably all know. Micholz was the chairman of the most important Soviet Jewish organization at the time too, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and the right person to approach. Having visited Kiev's Babi Yar in the fall of 1945, Micholz was struck by mass visits on the massacre's yard site and witnessed a new memorial culture in the making. In his letter, Dragunsky wrote, "What especially saddened me was that no graves were arranged. The little bones of my sisters and children are scattered about the fields. Cattle trampled them. In a word, all human dignity is lost. It's true that at my insistence, they are now taking action, but these facts induced me to write you a letter and raise the question of delegating to the Anti-Fascist Committee the work of setting up monuments for the executed children, old people, and women. This doesn't only refer to Jewish victims, but also many partisans, executed children, women, and old people are buried. You will be doing a great and necessary service through such work. We must erect fences, monuments, and inscriptions everywhere and show dates." So there's a lot to unpack here. On the most basic level, Dragunsky's letter highlights how the past manifests in the present, namely that the specific experience of the war and the Holocaust in the Soviet Union brought forth a specific task for projects of memorialization beyond particularly Jewish desires. What do I mean by that? At the end of the war, the Soviet Union literally lay in ruins. It has been estimated that the Nazi invasion saw the destruction of 1,700 Soviet towns, 70,000 villages, and 30,000 factories, with 1 in every 7 Soviet citizens killed. That is 27 million in total, including 2.7 million Soviet Jewish Holocaust victims. And the Holocaust in the Soviet Union was also perpetrated in distinct ways, as scholarship has shown before. While Jews from Western European countries such as France, from Poland, and some other parts of Europe were deported to and perished in the Nazi death camps, Soviet Jews, like Dragunsky's entire family, for the most part were executed in the immediate vicinity of their homes, in pits and trenches outside of Städtlach and towns. So in contrast to other parts of Europe, and as Seltzer has already shown, memorialization of Holocaust victims consequently took place primarily at these massacre sites on the Soviet periphery. Dragunsky, as seen in this letter, is also a pioneer of the more elaborate group initiatives of Holocaust monumentalization of later years. Starting in the 1960s, these groups mushroomed all across the Soviet Union, as we will see, alongside a steadily growing Soviet war cult and accelerated efforts as monumentalization. This carefully constructed war cult, though heavily focused on the final victory over fascism and Soviet heroism in doing so, could not ignore the immense suffering of the civilian population and laid the groundwork for the mass memorialization of its victims. And it helped legalize grassroots initiatives of Jews as well. And finally, Dragunsky's letter also outlines several standard steps that continued to dictate the successful building of a Holocaust monument in the Soviet Union. One needed initiative. This mostly led to the creation of local Jewish activist groups that were operated in the villages and towns where the monument was to be erected, and they had deep ties to other parts of the Soviet Union, mostly to the metropolises like Moscow or Leningrad, which also shows us, of course, the demographic nature of where Jews usually lived and where not anymore. One always also had to negotiate with authorities, which is, of course, a standard procedure everywhere. One often had to reinter or rebury the victims, which went, of course, against Jewish traditions, as the activists themselves often lamented. But it was necessary to honor the victims in an appropriate way, was the conclusion. And one had to organize for the monument to be crafted, installed, and engraved with an adequate inscription. What Dragunsky forgot to mention is that monuments always need rituals if there is a desire to sustain memory. The productive memory labor of installing a monument, in other words, had to go hand in hand with a collective will to remember and the desire to continue remembering. Monuments literally needed and had a social life. So in the following, I will outline 3 different case studies of Holocaust monumentalization, the accompanying memory ceremonies, and the role of Yiddish within it. Of special interest for us will not only be what actually happened at these monuments, but how the memory activity was framed in Soviet Yiddish publications, such as the Central Organ, Soviet Jewry. That is to say, we are interested not merely in the fact that there were monuments, which there were over 700 of them, but that they were part of a memory culture that sustained and fostered the memory of the Holocaust through Yiddish. Okay. Let's start with the Rumbula forest near Riga in Latvia. Rumbula was the central mass murder site for Jews of the Riga ghetto. In an issue of 1967, the Soviet Yiddish journal Soviet Jewry reported about a commemoration ceremony in honor of the 25th yahrzeit. A monument was erected by activists and ceremonies were held annually. The memorial ceremony at the mass grave included performances by writers, artists, cultural activists, and former Riga ghetto prisoners, as well as the Yiddish language performer Dine Reutkop, who recited Holocaust poetry by Hirsch Oscherowitz and Shmuel Halkin from the 1940s. The ceremony thus remembered Holocaust victims by utilizing the rich Soviet Yiddish Holocaust corpus from the 1940s, mostly forgotten in the West, as the scripture to do so. This corpus grew out of a rich tradition of anti-fascist thought and made sense of the Holocaust through Marxist ideas of anti-capitalism. Yiddish and not Hebrew became not only the language that marked these rituals as Jewish, For the older Yiddish-speaking generation, it demonstrated cultural continuity despite the terror of Stalinism. In the younger, mostly non-Yiddish-speaking generation, it instilled a sense of Yiddishkeit as part of their Jewish and Soviet identity. Yiddish played an important role also on Rumbula's monument. Strikingly, the Rumbula activists were able to change Latvian policies regarding monument inscriptions in general. Because of Jewish activism, as Seltzer has shown also, the authority issued a decree stating, and I quote, "To the extent possible, the ethnicity of the victims who perished in these locations should be taken into account." While scholarship has usually foregrounded the top-down attempts at whitewashing the specificity of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust, a shift in focus is important if we want to make sense of what was happening on the ground. Let us understand the monument through Soviet Yiddish eyes, namely through a long tradition of anti-fascism, internationalism, and cross-ethnic political solidarity. At the massacre site at Rumbula, the monument is inscribed with "To the victims of fascism," written in Latvian, Russian, and Yiddish, as you can see on this photograph. What is interesting here is that the monument itself transcends an imagined complete control of memory, right? Each language conjures up different conjugations and concretizations of fascist violence that do not need to be read in competition to one another. They can be seen as reinforcement. Each unit, from Russian to Latvian to Yiddish, concretizes the victim group without uncoupling the Holocaust from the total war against the Soviet Union. All victims were killed in Rumbula because they were Jewish, but also because they were communist living in Latvia. The myth of Judeo-Bolshevism had the most brutal real-time consequences during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and it is remembered in the inscription of the monument. But what about instances where the authorities did try to hinder activists from installing a monument, or where they insisted on a specific non-Jewish inscription? In these instances, Yiddish presented an even more important social glue, I argue. One such instance would be the monument in the Western Ukrainian town of Medzibysh that we might know as the birthplace of Hasidism. Initially, 2 plaques were intended for the monument, one in Yiddish, one in Russian. But the local authorities denied a request to have a Yiddish inscription and prohibited concrete indication that it were Jews that had been killed there. The activists were, however, able to negotiate with the authorities to give specific mention to the fact that these were victims of the Medzibysh ghetto, namely Jews. The journal Sowjetische Land honored the grassroots memory labor in Medzibysh with a special section. The report Notizen wegen Medzibyscher Ghetto includes both a letter to the journal editorial staff and a detailed survivor account. It commences as follows. I was born in the shtetl Medzibysh in the region of Khmelnytsky. In 1968, I visited my birthplace as the leader of a group of activists in order to immortalize the memory of the victims in the ghetto of Medzibysh. When we built the memorial and put the mass grave in order, Moshe Einhorn, one of those who miraculously saved themselves from fascist hell, entrusted me with his notes on how the Jews of Medzibysh perished. Therefore, I decided to send Einhorn's notes to the editorial office of Sowjetische Land, Avrom Weiner, Volgograd, which was, of course, formerly Stalingrad. So it is important to start with the insight that Avrom Weiner, the founder of a local Holocaust commemoration activist group, was convinced that Sowjetische Land was the right address for these sorts of materials. We further know that the monument attracted many Jews from across the Soviet Union to participate in the annual memorial ceremony. Sources even speak of a sort of pilgrimage. The memorial ceremony at the site of the mass shooting was usually followed by a visit to the grave of the Baal Shem Tov on the old Jewish cemetery. So these ceremonies also had specific local flavors to them. In Sovjetische Heimland's report, Moshe Einhorn, the Holocaust survivor, takes center stage and narrates his survivor story in detail. And in the layout, Einhorn's testimony is interlaced with photographs documenting the process of monumentalization. From marking and ordering the mass grave, as we can see here, to memorial gatherings at the erected monument. The text, photo interplay, tells a narrative of return, taking root, and rebirth by turning neglected mass graves into sanctified spaces of Jewish memorial rituals. Monuments were community generating, was the message as well. And while the monument itself is on the surface rather un-Jewish, Sovjetische Heimland's coverage clearly serves as a means to demarcate it as unapologetically Jewish through Yiddish. No discussion about Holocaust monuments in the Soviet Union is complete without touching on Babi Yar, of course. Indeed, every other site of mass murder of Jews on Soviet soil was in a way overshadowed by the immensity of Kiev's murder, of Kiev's Babi Yar, where in the course of 2 days, over 30,000 Jews were killed by the Germans. And paradoxically, it was Babi Yar that was monumentless until 1976, much longer than many, many other sites of the Holocaust on Soviet soil. The lack of a monument at Babi Yar suggested to the world that Holocaust memory was suppressed everywhere in the Soviet Union and hid from view all the activities that I have emblematically touched on before. And people, Akari Seltzer, for example, even speaks of Babi Yar syndrome, the obsession with Babi Yar and it not having a monument, overshadowed the study of of Holocaust memory in the Soviet Union generally. But Babi Yar played an important role in Soviet Yiddish vernacular Holocaust memory culture too. A year before the monument was finally unveiled in 1975, Arne Vergelis published his essay Der Denkmal in Babi Yar wird stehen le Deures in Sovjetische Heimland. Vergelis was the editor and censor of the journal, so it is significant that he made Babi Yar part of the Soviet Yiddish discourse. He could easily also ignore it. His essay starts out with a poetic reading of Babi Yar's topography of suffering. The ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, that old ravine, drenched with inexhaustible sorrow, endowed with its own climate of Elul, windless, with the secrecy of the heavens, with, so to speak, a unique body and soul. This piece of land is almost transparent from above and endlessly labyrinthine from deep under, soaked with blood and tears, completely empty and at the same time densely populated. With what and with whom, God only knows. His essay then swiftly turns into a discussion of how to best interpret the genocidal events that took place at Babi Yar and the Holocaust writ large, and how to adequately memorialize it. Vergelis reproduces a conversation with American Jewish tourists who are adamant in highlighting Babi Yar as an exclusively Jewish catastrophe. But Vergelis explains that the differentiation of victims had been the method of the fascists themselves, a product of reactionary nationalism that has been overcome in the Soviet Union. After all, and I quote, "For all martyrs, the blood which was spilled from their veins had one color." To be sure, Vergilius did clarify that the number of Jewish victims was proportionately much higher than of any other ethnicity. But we should remember that the Germans did not only kill Jews in Babi Yar. Babi Yar was different from the sites I have discussed before and brought with it questions of what Judith Butler has called grievability. Are certain lives more grievable than others? Whose life counts more than others? Vergilius had clear answers to that. He both eloquently propagates the ideas of internationalism and collective suffering under fascism, and strikes a blow to Western tendencies at singling out the genocidal assault against Jews, which in this reading only perpetuates a fascist methodology by racializing the victims in memory again. And this brings us to my final thoughts. Now, I do not want to argue that Vergilius is necessarily right in everything he said, but I think it falls short to simply discard what he says as a sort of Soviet propaganda. His text is important to contextualize vernacular Soviet Yiddish Holocaust memory culture in general. But more importantly, I think it raises questions about Holocaust memory in the contemporary world. A world that again sees capitalism tipping over into fascism everywhere. I believe we can learn from the Soviet Yiddish vernacular Holocaust memory culture in the way that it was true to a profound anti-fascist tradition and accentuated internationalist solidarity in pain over hierarchies of suffering. The specifically Jewish Holocaust was meaningful for all persecuted people, as the most radical crime fascism could and can lead to, was the message. Also here, the battle cry, never again, was crucial to the memorial culture. But this very culture was not built into a capitalist structure, and thus it was not competitive. It was aspiring to be decolonial, anti-imperial, and anti-capitalist in nature. The memory of the Holocaust in this tradition was meant as a cure to capitalism, which was rightly seen as the root cause of fascism and colonialism. And while we don't have to agree with everything Arndt Vergilius says, moving towards a critique of capitalism as part of the Holocaust memory in general is crucially important, I believe, as a way to make sure that something like this truly never happens again. Thank you so much.
We do have a couple of questions, so people in the audience, feel free, please, to type any additional questions you might have. Okay, this first one isn't exactly a question, but maybe you can comment on it, Miriam. Mm-hmm. It is my understanding that the Soviet Union did this, not for the sake of the Jews, but to say that this is what happens in the West. It was a pro-Soviet propaganda.
Yeah, I think that's a simplistic reading of it, but I think it is important to understand memorial culture generally as being not self-reflexive. And this is true for the memorial culture that we have in the West as well. It's usually outward looking, and definitely any culture of the Holocaust was a product of the Cold War. And thus, when we understand it from the Soviet authorities, which I didn't do, right? I'm looking from the bottom up and not from the top down. Of course, it was part also of the narrative of a continuing transnational fascist potential that you see in Western countries. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just one more question as of now. Why do you think Babi Yar has been so well remembered, more so than Rumbula Forest, where over 2 days, 30,000 Jews were killed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's not easy to answer because I think memory cultures are also so hinged on contingency. It was entirely shocking that Kiev's Jews were killed basically in the course of 2 days. And there is, of course, a difference, I guess, between, it was an immense crime in Kiev, and it took an immediate outcry in all of Soviet publishing. And therefore, I think the immediate response kind of hovered over the rest of Soviet Jewish memory cultures in general. You see that Babi Yar basically overshadowed any other attempt of commemorating the Holocaust on Soviet soil in Jewish remembrance themselves, even if they didn't come from Kiev. It just had such an immensity. Why this is the case, I think, has to do with coverage of the crimes, and that Rumbula was not as important as part of the coverage of the Holocaust on the Soviet Union.
Okay, we did get one more question. What are the more recent developments in the field of Jewish Holocaust memory? I mean, the times after the fall of the Soviet Union.
You mean in the post-socialist Russia, Ukraine, and is that the question? Or?
I assume so. Yeah, the more recent developments in that field since the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Right. I can basically say, and I've been part of kind of this, you could even say, memory imperialism. Arkady Seltzer speaks of this as well. That kind of the Western ideas of commemoration of the Holocaust made its way into these spaces as well. So our narratives and our forms of commemorating the Holocaust kind of entered the sphere of Russian Jews, Ukrainian Jews, Lithuanian Jews as well. You can also see, though, that Russia, for example, itself has now takes active part in the current memory wars that you see in Europe, meaning, for example, there's a plan to build a memorial museum, I think, in Sobibor. And now Russia is very active in kind of publishing or making available to researchers material on Sobibor that was formerly in secret archives. So there's an attempt to take part in these larger globalized discussions about the Holocaust as well. Zvi Gittelmann has his hand raised.
Yeah, he did write in a long comment here, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but
Okay.
I can read it. Arkady Seltzer was long preceded by his mentor Mordechai Altshuler,
Of course,
pointing out that there was some memorialization. See my book, Century of Ambivalence, for images of monuments put up by Jews. The great majority were removed by the authorities. Sovetish Heimland had a total tirage of 25,000, half of which were sent abroad. Few Soviet Jews could read it, and it had little public impact. Heimland was not the central Jewish organ. It was the only one, aside from something I can't pronounce, Berobidjaner Stern. JAFC was not the leading Jewish organ in the USSR in the 1940s. It was the only one. How does Rumbula inscription reflect anything about Zido Komuna? Your reading of Vergelis and capitalism can be discussed at another time.
Okay, yeah. There's not much to say to that. Of course, I know, of course, Zvi Gittelmann's important work. Of course, I also know about Mordechai Altshuler's important work and Arkady Seltzer's work. I find incredibly important. Of course, I'm actually not at all trying to rehabilitate the Soviet Union as moral. Of course, there was structural anti-Semitism. I tried to understand how many Soviet Jews tried to commemorate the Holocaust as part of the Soviet memory landscape. And I tried to not only focus on anti-Semitism against it. My view and my approach to these kinds of questions is an anti-lachrymose, is like in the anti-lachrymose tradition of Jewish studies, trying to understand Jewishness as a hybrid phenomenon that changes with the social conditions that you find yourself in. There were many Jews that still spoke Yiddish in the Soviet Union, also after Stalin. There were many Jews that also read Sovjetisch Heimland. The fact that it didn't reach the point of a mass organ, I don't find so important, because it's about every single life that it did touch. And I believe that it is important to understand the developments in the Soviet Union through the traditions that were there in regards of Yiddish culture, which had a very strong anti-fascist tradition, for example, was Marxist, and many Soviet Jews remained proud Soviet citizens. So I think we have to discard kind of this Cold War narrative of Jewishness was entirely impossible in the Soviet Union. Because the fact of the matter is that there were 700 monuments in the Soviet Union dedicated to the Holocaust, and that Soviet Jews commemorated it in their own terms that were different from what we think maybe is right, and that was different from our culture here, for sure.
Okay, we actually got quite a few more questions, so we have time maybe for 2 or 3 more. Here's a good one. Can you talk more about the rituals that accompanied the memorials during the Soviet times? Also, what was the treatment of the memorials after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Right. Yeah, the ceremonies were held usually annually. In 1965, a Victory Day was pronounced a holiday in the Soviet Union for everyone. So ceremonies would usually take place either on Victory Day, which is May 9th, or on the specific yard sites of the massacres of these specific monuments, or where the monuments were erected. And what is really fascinating, I find, especially for the case of the Soviet Union that we associate with immobility, stasis, I think, is that many Jews actually made their way from where they were living, mostly from Moscow, Leningrad, these places, to these little towns on the Soviet periphery. And this is where they met each year to commemorate the Holocaust. But the beautiful thing, of course, is also that they came together as Jews. And so this was a community that was generated through these activities that were taking place. All of what I've described in how to erect the monument, all these negotiations with authorities, the fight to have these monuments in the way they wanted, the fact that the ceremonies was taking place, all of this is, of course, a source of bonding between different Jewish communities from different places in the Soviet Union. They all had their own ideas of what it meant to be a Jew in the Soviet Union. And it is interesting that at these annual gatherings, they came together to commemorate the Holocaust, but also, of course, in a way celebrating that they came together, right? there was kind of a double semiotics in these ceremonies. The second part of the question I now forgot.
Okay, I'll find it.
Sorry about that.
No problem. I'm just reading a lot of questions here. Also, what was the quote unquote treatment of the memorials after the collapse?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I have to refer to Arkadi's book. He's already shown that, I mean, we can say that most of these memorials or monuments are not in a good state. And there is activities. I've been working, for example, with an organization in Germany that tries to kind of renovate monuments or erect new ones in places. So there is an ambition to sustain kind of this culture, but also to demarcate new memorial sites as well.
Are there national Holocaust memorials or museums in larger cities such as Moscow or Leningrad?
Right now there are, of course, yes. There is the Jewish Museum in Moscow, that the Jewish Museum of Tolerance, I believe. But I guess the Holocaust was part of the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, and it was part of a war cult that also had as one of its outlets museums. But the specific Jewish going into the Holocaust as we know it in the West, like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which, by the way, is of course also a development or was opened in the 1990s, didn't really exist. There is in Vilnius in Lithuania a Holocaust museum, and they are even planning to build a new one that I'm also involved in.
Okay, I guess we'll conclude with one more question. How would you characterize generally the difference between Soviet era and post-Soviet era monuments? What new motifs emerge?
That's really difficult to answer, since the monuments that I've been discussing were diverse in and of itself already. We can see that it was very localized in the way that Holocaust memory specifically was suppressed, something that, of course, Zvi Gittelmann has pointed out before. But there were also, it was dependent on where you were in the Soviet Union and who your authorities were, whether a monument was successful in the way that you envisioned it, or if you had to negotiate. Of course, for example, the Soviet Star is not part of a monument that is built after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would say that the monuments that have been erected now are usually crafted by local artists in the Ukraine, for example. At least the organization that I've been working with has usually commissioned Ukrainian artists to do so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In addition to thanking our audience and for all the questions, and thank you so much to Miriam, I also would like to thank our Director of Academic Programs who helped to organize this event, Malgorzata Bakalarz-Duverger. And we will be sending everybody who registered for this program a link to the video so you can watch it again at your leisure. Okay, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.